Okay guys, Alec, Peirce Vintage Scuba. Now I want to clarify first of all that this is not really just a vintage scuba little episode here, because this particular process, this explanation applies to all regulators. Now specifically we're going to be talking about single hose regulators. So you double hose guys that don't want to hear about single hose regulators, even though they dominate the market and are the best by far. Rob. This is about single hose regulators, and specifically because it is a reg that most of you use, vintage or not. And there are single hose vintage regulators. Sam LeCoq, founder of Sportsways, made one of the first single hose regulators in the world, and then later he made two hose regulators. Yeah, think about that for a minute. How to adjust the breathing effort. You know, when you suck on the rig, is it really hard or very, very easy? How is that adjusted? Because it is adjusted. The first stage is set up, clean, service, and setup, or from the factory. It's set up to do one job only. It delivers air at 150 psi, period. That's all it does. That's all it does. Doesn't do anything else. Doesn't affect the breathing effort, doesn't do anything else. Just gives you a supply of air, 150. All of the breathing effort is adjusted at the second stage. How does that work, and how is that adjusted? Well, let's take a little look. I've made a diagram here on the board. Kevin, can you swing the camera over there? And I'm going to end this diagram. You may not recognize this. It probably looks complicated to you, like the inner workings of a washing machine, but no, this is actually a regulator. And if I point this out to you, then you'll understand it. This is a hose coming from the first stage. Green is air. So there's green air, not green air, you know what I mean. Air is green. Air comes through the hose from the first stage. It's over here somewhere. And there's a big nut, and that big nut fastens onto this threaded shaft right here. That's what holds it onto, and I happen to have a second stage here. So the hose comes in like this, and there's the threaded portion that right there that I'm trying to show you, and the big nut. Simple. Now the air goes through, and inside, you can see this inside portion here, it comes to a little, almost to a point with a little hole in it. That's what's called, there's different names for it. The orifice, the fixed seat, there's a dozen and one different names for it. But essentially, that little device is the nozzle that the air goes through. And here's what it looks like in real life. I'm going to get you to zoom in here, okay? You see, there it is right there. You see that there? So you can see it's a threaded tube, and you see there's a little hole in the end. Can you see the hole in the end? Yeah. And there's an O-ring on it. That doesn't really matter for this explanation. So a little hole in the end. So that's threaded, and it sits inside this other big threaded tube. Sits right in there like that. Just that easy. Threads in, it sits there. And it has a smallish hole at that end. So the air comes from the hose and goes through there, and it goes through that nozzle. And then from there, it goes through and into your mouth. When you suck on it, it goes through into your mouth. Okay? Now, you want the air to stop. You only want air to come into your mouth when you draw on it, right? When you suck. Yeah, exactly. So there must be some way to stop that air from going through the nozzle. And there is. Right here. Can you see that red thing? If you take a look, you see there's a red thing. Red means it's a seal. It's a rubber disc. Could be silicone or it's plastic. It's a seal, soft seal. And that soft seal goes right up against the end of that nozzle. Right up against the end of that nozzle and seals it off. Just like my finger. Seals it off. So the air doesn't flow until you want it to. Okay? And that seal is connected by a rod to another small mechanism here, just basically a pivot. And that pivot's connected to a lever. And that lever sits on the diaphragm. There's water on the outside, and you're on here. And when you suck on this, you pull the diaphragm in, which pulls the lever, and that seat moves out of the way, and you get air. That's how a second stage works. Air comes from the first stage. It stops right there at the seal. When you suck on the diaphragm moves down. It moves the lever, which pulls that seal out of the way, and you get air. That's all there is to it. However, a couple of questions. If you've been following this, there might be a couple of questions that pop into your mind. Okay, you know the air coming in here is 150 psi. It's a fair bit of force. So it's a fair bit of force pushing on that seal. Why doesn't it just push the seal out of the way and just go past it? What keeps the seal in place until the lever pulls it out of the way? There has to be something in there to stop it from going out of the way. And there is something in there. I didn't put it on. because I wanted you to ask that question. Now I'll put it on. There's a spring in there. That's right. There's a spring right here, right there. I'm going to make it purple. Purple stands for spring. Ask any mechanic. So there's a spring in there. And you can see that the way it's sitting in there, that spring is pushing the seal against the end of the nozzle. So that spring is pushing it against the nozzle, which is against the seat, the seal, which is pushing in the nozzle and holding the air back. Let me stand over here. This is better. So you see the spring is pushing the seal and it's pushing against the nozzle to hold that air back. That's simple. Now all you have to do, you just simply have to adjust that spring a little bit. If you adjust the spring to make it tighter, tighter, and tighter, finally it'll push against 150 psi, and the 150 psi of air will not come through. It'll stop flowing. Until you suck, the lever moves and it pulls it out of the way. Then you get air. As soon as you stop, the diaphragm goes back up, the lever goes back up, and the spring pushes the seat back against the nozzle. That's really just that simple. Okay? So the spring keeps that seal against the end of the nozzle and keeps the air from flowing until you suck. And when you suck on it, diaphragm moves, you get air. Just that easy. Okay? Now, there's the secret, folks, right there. If the air coming from the first stage is 150 psi, and the force that the spring is exerting on the seal to stop that air from flowing through is also 150 psi, it'll sit there. Nice and smoothly, nothing happens. If they suck on it and you pull the seal out of the way, air goes through. If you stop sucking, it'll go back, stop the airflow. Now, what happens if the first stage, for some reason, has more pressure, more air comes through than 150 psi? So let's say, for some reason, the first stage, a bit of ice, a bit of dirt, whatever reason, the first stage malfunctions very slightly, and the air pressure from the first stage increases to 160. So you got 160 coming down. But you haven't changed the spring's still set for 150. Well, obviously, the air will push that seal out of the way and air will go through. It's called a free flow. That's why sometimes you put your regulator on and you turn the air on and you get air coming from the first stage is higher than that spring pressure, so it pushes the seal out of the way and you get exactly. So what had to be adjusted a little bit. All right, now suppose the air pressure coming from the first stage is lower than 150 for whatever reason. Let's not get into that right now. But the air pressure coming from the first stage is, say, 140 instead of 150. Now the air comes down and is pushing against that seal with the pressure of 140. But the spring's pushing against with the pressure of 150. You've got to suck really hard to get that seat out of the way, to get there. It's going to be very hard to breathe. So the whole secret of having a smooth, easy breathing regulator is right there with that little spring. That's right. And how do they adjust it? Well, if you look at my tech tips on adjusting the second stage, you'll see that there's a special tool. It essentially is a screwdriver. It's not really a screwdriver. It's an inline adjusting tool. Fancy name for screwdriver. And what that screwdriver does, it reaches inside here like this, and at the end of that nozzle, there's a slot, and you put the screwdriver in, and you can turn the slot clockwise, and that pushes the slot more that way, which increases the pressure on the spring. Gets harder to breathe, right? If you unscrew, turn counterclockwise, the nozzle slowly threads back this way. It takes the nozzle away from the seat, away from the spring pressure. It gets easier to breathe. Now, if you take it back too far, it'll start to free flow. And if you go in too far, you can't get a breath of air. So the secret is, when adjusting this, is to do it as carefully as possible so you're right on the edge. The intermediate pressure from the first stage is 150, and the spring pressure is 150. Now, any little breath, any movement of that diaphragm, and you'll start to get air, which is what you want. But when you stop breathing, the air stops. That's what you want. Not impossible to achieve. With an inline adjusting tool, it's pretty easy. It does take a little bit of work. It can be done manually, but it's a laborsome progress. Take the hose off, adjust it, put it back on, turn the air on. Anyway, so it's a long time adjusting it, but that's how it's done. So that's how it's done. That's how that second stage it works, and that's how you adjust your breathing effort. Just that easy. As I say, this is a bit of a tech tip because this also applies to modern regulators. But I'm going to show you a regulator in another short episode that made this process very, very easy. Unfortunately, it is a vintage episode because that particular regulator is not made anymore, and it's a shame because it was one of the very best regulators ever made. And the second stage, this adjustment for breathing effort, was very easy. It could be done underwater, quite frankly, but it could certainly be done very, very easily by a diver with a simple tool, and he could just adjust it in a second. I'm going to show you that in another episode, how to adjust the breathing effort on a decor second stage. Anyway, I hope that was of interest to you. Maybe there's something in there that you learned. Talk to you soon. Alec Peirce from Vintage Scuba.